Many of us dreamed of being a pirate when we were kids. The open ocean, wind in our hair, the complete freedom, and most importantly, no parents telling you to clean your room or take out the rubbish. But then as an adult, the appeal of having clean living quarters starts to make more sense, and the idea of picking up your dirty laundry instead of leaving it to fester suddenly doesn't sound so bad. But what if you couldn't? What if your quarters were essentially whatever spot you could find on a hard wooden floor? Life on a pirate ship is never as glamorous as it may seem, and pirate quarters were dirty and uncomfortable. Welcome to Walk the Plank. Pirate quarters. Most ships were built for speed, space, or stability. Very few ships in the golden age of piracy were built to accommodate large crews in comfort, and so living on a ship for weeks at a time was always going to be one of the downsides of piratical lifestyle. With space being at a premium, only the highest ranking members of the crew got their own private quarters. The captain would often have his own cabin, but depending on the ship and crew, it was pretty unlikely anyone else would rank highly enough to get their own room. For the majority of the crew, they'd be bunking down with their fellows in a single large room below decks. In summer, any space below deck would have been stiflingly hot and humid, and many pirates chose to sleep under the stars to get away from it. In winter, it would be freezing cold and still damp as they couldn't keep the sea out for long. As soon as you go below deck, it becomes hard to stand up. Tall men would have to stoop to avoid hitting their heads on the beams, and some spaces might be as little as 4'6" tall. The crew's quarters were often a multi-purpose space and would have been used for more than just sleeping. They had to carry out their entire lives in this one room. It was often used as a place to store equipment or as a place to socialize and catch up on work that couldn't be done on deck. Although there were hatches to open between the deck and the crew's quarters which could have let in light and air, they were usually kept shut for safety and to avoid seawater getting in. That meant that the only light would have come from tallow candles, which only would have added to how disgusting it was. These candles are known for giving off a fatty, greasy smell when lit. Some ships had room for hammocks to be hung up at night, which could mean a relatively comfortable night's sleep, but other ships wouldn't even have this luxury, and the crew would have to make do with whatever space on the floor they could get. Sleeping in a hammock was definitely preferable to rolling about on the floor as the ship moved, although it wasn't always guaranteed that you'd even get that small comfort. Other larger ships had built-in bunks that were stacked 2 or 3 bunks high, and while that sounds better than sleeping on the floor, it's likely that these were shared bunks to maximize space. So not only would you have been physically uncomfortable in your quarters, it's likely that it would have stunk too. As soon as you ventured below decks, you'd be assaulted by a variety of unpleasant odors from mildew to body odor as damp sails grew moldy and men couldn't wash themselves. Maintaining a high level of cleanliness was not a priority for most pirates, and the limited waste disposal wouldn't have helped much. Ships at that time didn't have proper sanitation facilities, and so most waste disposal was done straight into the sea. However, if the weather was bad, a trip to the bathroom, also called the head, would have been a rather unappealing prospect. Even at the best of times, the head was basically just a hole cut into a plank that let everything fall into the sea below. On a smaller ship, pirates would have used chains or pistales, primitive urinals, or platforms that extended out from the side of the ship. And without toilet paper, cleaning yourself after going to the bathroom would mean using a communal rag or swab that dangled next to the head. Filth and other waste could accumulate in the sleeping quarters disturbingly easily, as pirates who didn't want to make the trip to the head during a storm used the so-called piss tubs instead. And can you imagine that anybody would have had that great an aim when they're drunk on a rolling ship and only have a candle to guide them? You can imagine how easy it would have been to knock the tubs over as well. Soap? What soap? Life as a pirate involved a lot of manual labor, and without deodorant or a hot shower at the end of the day, you can imagine that it would have been incredibly ripe below decks. Most pirates weren't rich and didn't have multiple sets of clothes, leaving them to wear and rewear the same garments for days at a time. Pirates also didn't have access to clean water for bathing, as any water kept on board ship would have been reserved for drinking. There are some stories of pirates being lowered into the sea to cool off on hot days, but there's no mention of doing that to keep clean. Sometimes an invalid would be able to have a hot bath when the crew went ashore, but baths were a real luxury and wouldn't have happened often enough to make the crew's quarters any less dirty. However, some pirates did try to take care of their hygiene. Some pirates chewed on chew sticks to clean their teeth, although this would have been difficult to replace if you lost it at sea. Even if they tried to take care of their teeth using chew sticks, many pirates suffered from scurvy due to their poor diets. Most crew would only have been eating salted pork and hard biscuit, and the lack of vegetables, nutrients, and vitamins caused their teeth to start falling out. One sea surgeon called William Clowes talked about how grim the results were, describing their breath as a filthy savior, and saying, quote, "Their gums were rotted even to the very roots of their very teeth." Some ships also may have had soap on board, but it's relatively unlikely that this would have been the case for most pirate ships. During the 18th century, the whaling industry grew in size, and pirates were known to attack the whaling ships for their cargo. Whether that was to use the soap or simply sell it on, we'll never know. Additional crewmates. Along with the human crew, there were many other critters that lived on a pirate ship and added to the general grime. Ships were full of vermin like cockroaches, rats, and other creatures that would infest everything from your hair to your blankets, leaving you itchy and prone to infectious diseases like dysentery and typhus. And once you came down with the flux, everything on ship would become a whole lot grimmer, as this particular disease causes extreme diarrhea. In the close quarters you'd experience in a pirate ship, you can imagine that everyone would be aware of your suffering, and it was dangerous too. Living so closely together, not having access to clean water, and generally living in a dark and sweaty room meant that passing on the so-called bloody flux was incredibly likely. Skin conditions like boils and rashes were also common complaints for a pirate at sea, since they didn't change their clothes or wash frequently. As well as the smell, pirates would be covered in lice, fleas, and a particularly unpleasant parasite called scabies. And it wasn't just lice you had to worry about. Maggots were a constant concern for pirate crews. The food on a pirate ship was far from luxurious, with minimal fresh produce available for the first few weeks. A pirate's diet generally consisted on salted beef or pork and dry biscuits. While pirates did generally bring fresh meat, vegetables, and cheese on board, they didn't last long. Long-lasting foodstuffs were brought onto the ship in big barrels and would keep for a few weeks before everything started to rot. After a few weeks exposed to the elements, the biscuits would become infested with maggots or weevils, and the dried meat would start to rot. It was said that pirates would eat in a darkened room so that they didn't have to see what they were eating. In particular, so they didn't have to see when their meals were more maggot than not. As the drinking water began to stagnate and get dangerous to drink, pirates would switch to drinking alcohol instead, which cannot have improved cleanliness on board ship. The captain's cabin. Captains, paying passengers, and important hostages would all have been afforded a little more luxury than the rest of the crew, although this can't be said of every ship. Some ships were far more democratic and the captain slept among the crew, but on certain vessels the captain would have used the great cabin. This was a private room either at the bow or stern of the ship. Contrary to the crew's quarters, this cabin would have had windows to let in natural light and may have also had a bed. It doesn't mean that this room was always reserved for the captain. At times the crew would come in and use the space. Although the modern concept of pirate captains is that they dressed finely in highly decorated coats and trousers, it's likely that they didn't smell any better than the rest of the crew. It's likely that a pirate captain would have had a second set of clothes, but most likely would have worn the same practical waistcoat and breeches day in, day out. When they did have a chance to wash their blood-stained, sweaty clothes with miscellaneous stains, it's not likely that they'd have been using soap to do it. Outro. A pirate's life was hard, there's no doubt about that. Between exposure to the elements, risk of bodily injury, and harsh punishments, you'd think that's the worst that life had to offer them. But the constant stench of mildew, body odor, and sewage must have made it completely unbearable at times. The quarters were cramped and stuffy, with no space to stretch out or get away from the rest of the crew. While pirates had to spend a lot of their time maintaining the ships and keeping it in good condition, it seems like caring for the crew was a low priority, and their quarters reflected this fact. When storing cargo was more important than providing somewhere for people to sleep, you know that's gonna be a hard place to survive. Thank you for watching this episode of Walk the Plank. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and let us know in the comments if there's anything you'd like us to cover in future videos. Hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!